I recently picked up a box of HFC Mac 11's off Reddit. It's just a parts box. It wasn't very expensive. It's kind of a hard deal to pass up. Had a couple guns, 9 mags or 8 or 9 mags that were in kind of mixed condition. Supposedly the pistols weren't really working too well. But I got all the parts. I figured, why not? These are pretty simple. I'll try it out and see what I can do. So to start, I'll go ahead and gas up a mag and I'll test out the working gun and just make sure everything works on it, make sure the bolt cycles, there's no cracking or creaking, and it does. Everything works on it. Pretty excited. Seems like it kicks pretty well, but it actually isn't indicating of a real problem. But it does actually cycle. That's the important part, and I'll get to what's wrong a little bit later. The stocks, there's enough parts to do, I think it was 4 stocks if I remember, but only one of them was actually working, and I'm pretty sure it was a KWA stock, because most of the HFC ones, they have these little pins that are missing, so I have to replace those. Got a smorgasbord of mags. Usually these things are like 40 bucks a piece, so it's a pretty good deal. The bolts on it is going to have to be replaced. It's chewed out the back end of it, but otherwise I've got some bodies, I've got parts and grips and all that, and have enough to build a couple of decent guns. So, got it gassed up, load some BBs into it, and I'm going to chrono it just to see where it's starting out with, or at least on the working one. And it's shooting about 290 to 300 FPS. It's a nearly empty propane tank, so the FPS goes off, but 300 is pretty close to what the what a new one's supposed to be shooting.
Ooh.
So, we'll get into how the gun actually works. This is an NS1 system, and what I'm pushing on with the Q-tip is a valve. It's a spring-loaded valve that's on the tip of the nozzle. And so normally, when there's no BBs in the mag, all the gas is diverted right into the recoil system, and it'll kick at full power, very high efficiency. As soon as you put a BB in the mag, it'll load that into the chamber, and that valve is opened up, and that allows gas to go into the chamber. That fires the BB out, and then the valve ends up closing behind the BB, and then that initiates the recoil. And one of the things that I noticed with these mags is on the, I think they're KSC or KWA mags, the BBs double stack a lot tighter. I think the channel is a little bit wider than the HFCs. And the other thing is that the KSCs, the lips are tighter on them. They don't let BBs leak out as easily. Whereas some of the HFC mags, they need to be replaced.
Oh, mag.
So, the hop-up system in the barrel, it's pretty standard for a cheaper gun. It's just a set screw that turns up and down the hop-up, and there's a little rope in that holds everything in. The bucking looks really similar to a VSR type. One of them is actually pretty swollen up, and I'll show that a little bit later on. So the next thing to do is break the gun down, break all the guns down, break down all the valves, and we'll drop them into an ultrasonic degreaser. So I found, I like using the purple industrial degreasers, the kind of stuff that like burns your fingers out. Dish soap doesn't really seem to cut silicone oil that well, at least not any that I've had any experience with, whereas this, you can almost paint, like sometimes you can actually paint plastic parts after using this. And it's pretty straightforward. Get the degreaser, I think this is like 1 to 8 dilution, drop them in the ultrasonic and let it run for a little while. Pull the parts out, you rinse them off, make sure they don't have any degreaser left on them, just because of the smell. I'm going to lay everything out and let them air dry. And I've actually got more receivers than guns, so I'll use the ones that are in a little bit better condition. The finish isn't so worn down and smoothed out. I'll take an air dryer and just dry off all the parts so that the zinc doesn't get eaten. One of these parts, and I'm assuming this is a KWA one, but it's been copper plated, which I guess just makes it a little more resistant to corrosion. It's a little bit nicer part, but I'll keep it like it is. There was a little bit of spray paint on one of the outer barrels, and it looks like the degreaser had attacked it. The degreaser, at least these industrial ones, are actually really good for stripping paint off of plastic parts, but they will actually strip off factory paint, so you have to keep that in mind and be a little careful with that. Yeah, we'll take a look and just see how nasty the water comes out. You can see it's gone from a vibrant purple to brown. So now that all the parts are cleaned and greased, I can go go ahead and do the repairs and reassemble everything. You can see the degreaser pulled a bit of paint out of the mags, and some of the aluminum parts you can de-anodize them. One of the receivers on the grip actually has a crack on it, and so I'll try to fix that with some super glue and see if that'll hold up at all. The mag valves, some of these O-rings are pretty crushed, and I'd probably have to special order a bunch of them. I don't have these small sizes on hand, so I'll have to figure out which mags leak and go from there. A couple of these little rubber seals on the top of the mags are swollen, and you can see on the left it isn't swollen and it fits really square, whereas the right side was a little bit rough. I always like to use some RTV whenever I close up these mags, just around these bottom seals, because they tend to dry out and they get compressed and they just don't seal that well, so a little bit of RTV goes a long way. And once you get some goop on there, you just kind of pack it in there, make sure it's all clean, put the pins back in, and I'll do that with the rest of the other mags off camera. And then it's just take the upper valves, go ahead and snap on all the O-rings, match them up to see if it work. What I'll probably do is I'll put them all together, I'll see which mags leak, and then I'll figure out from there which O-rings I need to order, because it may not be necessary to order them all. And I'll use a little bit of Loctite on these pins just to keep them from falling out so easily, because some of them are a little on the loose side. The mag followers, a lot of them are in pretty rough shape. They're either bent or just straight broken. So I got a little bit of JB Weld and tried to fix them up, but the JB Weld really just didn't hold up that well. What I could probably do is maybe get some 3D printing done. So the buckings, the two on the left, you can see they're actually a little bit smaller than the one on the right. The one on the right is actually soaked in and it's kind of swelled, and it won't actually retain BBs anymore, which for these NS1 systems is actually really important for that valve to actually work correctly. And there's this kind of nasty, unhealthy looking spring, and I'll probably go ahead and change that out. It's a little stiff, it's not very smooth or crisp. The rest of the valve's in good shape though. Mechanically, the action, everything's there, nothing was broken or damaged, so reassembling the lowers is actually pretty easy, which is kind of nice because those parts aren't easy to find. And just put it back together the way it comes apart, make sure it's got lubrication in there, make sure everything's smooth and put in, and these are pretty simple parts. I've been using bicycle chain lube, which is, it's sort of like a wax lube and it dries and that way it doesn't attract dirt as easily. So since there's no dampening on the back of the bolts and it kind of hits pretty hard when it recoils, I'm going to go ahead and add a little pad to it. And so I just get some acetone, kind of wipe down the back of the bolt, wipe down the patch, and I'll use a little bit of super glue to stick it on there. And it should make the recoil feel just a little bit nicer, not like it's beating the gun to death. So go ahead and snap it all back together, put the bolt in, which this actually isn't too difficult once you kind of get used to it. I do have to replace one of those body pins. I'll have to build another one, and I'll show that later on. But bolt works, stock works, everything seems to be functional and good on it. So I'll go ahead and load up a mag here and give it a little test run here in a moment. It seems like it's a really common problem for these guns. The bolt has a tendency to split itself in half just by the way they're designed. The recoil spring is pushing forward on the plastic part, whereas the hammer, when it strikes, pushes back on the metal part and it just seems to split them in half. So they make metal one, and I may end up picking up one of those if I decide I want to keep these guns, or I'll just go with another plastic one and reinforce it. I'm also going to go ahead and change out that spring. I've got an assortment of springs from other things I've taken apart, and so put that on there. Looks a little nicer, it's a little bit snappier, a little bit smoother. I'll go ahead and test it first without any BBs in the mag. No problem. I'll go ahead and retest it with BBs, and I'll explain it in a second. You can see it doesn't quite recoil. It takes the first shot, something causes it to kick back, but it doesn't kick back hard enough to fully reset itself all the way there. And then, since it doesn't latch, it drops for a second shot, but it's open bolt. So what happens is that hammer, it's not hitting the gas valve as hard as it did the first time, So it still fires a second shot, but it's a lot less powerful, and it's just kind of a negative feedback loop. Yeah. Okay, so what's going on there? And I'll just go ahead and disclose it. Later, I figured out the recoil spring wasn't stiff enough. I actually added an extra spring to it to make it a little bit stiffer, and that seems like that's fixed most of the recoil problems. So the way the NS1 system works is, and I was showing you earlier with the Q-tip, and most of it works the same as an NS2 system. On this one, you have this little valve right here, and so when there's no BB in the chamber, that valve is shut. Right now it's shut. And so the gas goes out, pushes on that little plastic bit, and that kicks it back. But when there's a BB in the chamber, it holds that valve open, basically between the BB and the sort of bucking speed bump, holds a valve open, and so when the gun is fired, gas is diverted outside that nozzle, that pushes on the BB, and then that expels the BB out the chamber, and then once the BB is out of the way, that valve is able to snap shut, and that pushes air back into the chamber. And then of course it just operates like a normal, like pretty much every other gas gun, where the gas expands a piston, that expands that sort of, it expands that inner bolt, this guy right here, and then that pushes the whole thing open. And one of the problems that I was having with this is that that bolt, since it's not quite hitting that valve hard enough, it's not letting enough gas out. And of course, if there's not enough gas going out, now the BB will fire, but the valve won't snap back fast enough, and that was one of the theories I tried on one of the guns. But it doesn't snap back fast enough, it doesn't get enough pressure built up into the chamber, and it doesn't kick itself open hard enough, which that causes the bolt to not come back as far as it needs to, so that the next time it hits even softer, which means less gas, which means less recoil, and so it ends up basically puttering out after a couple shots. And since I have two guns, essentially, I have parts for two guns, I'm going to actually go ahead and try converting one of these into something like an NS1 system, or an NS2 system, sorry. Because the NS2 system, it doesn't use this sort of valve that depends on where the BB's there. It's called, I think, a float valve or a rocket valve. And when the gas is brought past this valve, it kind of sucks it shut. And then that, of course, closes the valve, and then that puts gas into the chamber, and that starts the recoil. So they'll both act the same way. They'll both fire if there's no BB in the chamber, but the NS2 system should behave pretty close to the same whether or not there's a BB in the chamber. And I'll go ahead and I'll show you that here in a moment. So I took one of the bolts, and this was an experiment to try. I drilled out and tapped sort of a hammer part, and I put in a little set screw, and what the set screw lets me do is adjust where the bolt hits the valve versus how far the nozzle is in the chamber. And there's a little bit of an adjustment. I haven't really figured out how to fine-tune it yet, but I do like to experiment with something like that. So I mentioned earlier I had to replace one of the body pins, and so I had some of these random looking pins out in the garage, so I went ahead and cleaned them up, and they're actually about the right size. And so since this doesn't have the internal retaining stuff, I'm going to go ahead and add a little snap pin on it using another little pin that I cut and milled out on something. So it snaps out. And then what I can do is stick a spring in behind it with a set screw. So we tap one side of this, and that'll let me snap a little set screw in there. And of course, it's really nice to kind of break down a bunch of stuff, because then you have little springs for all these little bits. So now I've got a little retainer, and the pin will actually keep itself in. And on the front of the receiver, I went ahead and put a little hole for that pin to snap into. And so now I can just pop the thing in and out. And it looks pretty good. I think it matches up pretty nicely with the copper selector. I don't think I'm going to repaint that. So next up, I'm going to take one of these valves and convert it to something closer to the NS2 system that uses a float valve rather than this sort of spring-loaded pressure valve. And the nice thing is this valve is made out of brass, which means I can solder to it. So I got a little piece of copper there, and I'm going to make a little, sort of a little fin there that the gas can kind of suck on. I guess I guess that's how you would describe it. I'm going to solder that into it, load that into the valve body, and then I've got a spring from my little assortment that I can sort of retain in there with this little ring. I use a little bit of Loctite just to kind of hold it in for now. And so far, I put a few mags through it and it's held up. And this is more an experiment just to see if I can do it. I tried a few other different pins and designs, and I found that that was probably the best one. And this is what actually ended up fixing the guns, or at least it seemed like it had the biggest impact. And it was essentially just adding more spring pressure on the recoil spring so that it would hit the valve harder. The mags were a little bit wobbly, so what I usually like to do is I get some of this sort of thin acrylic sheet stuff, and you can get this off like any clamshell packaging because it's usually really straight, it cuts pretty easily, it super glues on really nicely, and you can usually carve and shape it. And I've got some little pads on the outside there, I've got another one on the inside, and so everything fits nice and tight. But since it's a little bit tighter, I found I need to take just a little bit off the mag catch. And now it's time to test them out. First up, I've got the NS2 conversion here. I'm shooting about 250, 245, which most of that would probably come back from changing out that internal spring. And then I've got the original NS1 here, and it shoots about 320, 310, which is pretty much factory. That's basically working like it should. Yeah, so after this is probably a month of work, just kind of troubleshooting and testing and getting parts, and I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. Well, anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you maybe found some useful little things that you can try on your own Mac 11's.